Sit back and listen to this extremely interesting story. As Sandy sat at the patio and thought about her affair with John, her thoughts were interrupted as Steve entered her backyard. He was wearing the short cut-off jeans and white sleeveless shirt that he had been wearing earlier. Steve walked up to the patio table and sat in the chair next to Sandy and said, "Beautiful morning, isn't it, Sandy? Do you mind if I join you?" Sandy was quiet for a moment as she thought about how to handle the awkward situation. An hour earlier she had watched Steve's exhibition show as he stripped in front of the window of his house. She thought, he has some nerve to approach me like this. He must think he really impressed me with his little show. "Sandy, I just had to come over and ask you to forgive me for getting a little carried away this morning. It's just that when I saw you looking out of your full-length window this morning, wearing only your white blouse and black heels, something just came over me." After no response from Sandy, he continued, "Well, actually, I think you did enjoy watching me. You didn't turn away or close your curtains until you got to see everything you wanted to see." Sandy replied, "You know what I think, Steve. I think you are shameless. I saw you trying to show off in front of me yesterday in the window when I was watering my plants. And this is not the first time I see you prancing in front of the window with almost nothing on. It's kind of funny that you always manage to time it when I'm home alone or when Alex is out of your sight," she continued. Steve chuckled a little nervously and replied, "You know you aren't exactly innocent. That little sundress you were wearing yesterday was practically see-through with the sun behind you. I could see your legs all the way up, right through the material." Sandy replied, "Well, I had no idea that you could see through my dress with the sun to my back, but I could sure tell you liked watching me." Steve began to feel that he now had the upper hand, and he smiled at Sandy and said, "I've been watching you for a long time, baby. You always look attractive, and by the way, you have excellent taste in clothes." Steve adjusted his chair closer to Sandy, turning it slightly so he was facing her. He put his right hand on her right knee and said, "When I saw you unbuttoning that blouse this morning, I thought, this is it. She will finally show me that beautiful figure of hers." Sandy replied, "I don't know where you think this is going, Steve. I like you as a friend and neighbor, but I have no intentions of having an affair with you. I'm sorry I lead you on this morning, but you know that you started that little peep show game." Sandy grabbed Steve's wrist and tried to push his hand away from her knee. Being much stronger than her, he effortlessly slid his hand higher and could have gone further if he wanted to. "You wouldn't happen to have a cup of coffee to offer your friendly neighbor?" "I could really use some this morning," he said. Sandy stood up and said, "Wait here a minute, Steve, I'll get you some." Sandy walked through the sliding patio door and entered her kitchen. As she began to pour the coffee, she heard the door open and saw Steve enter her home. Sandy was beginning to get angry and said in a stern voice, "Steve, I asked you to wait outside on the patio. I didn't invite you to come in. We can continue our discussion outside. I think it would be better if we talk in here," he replied. "After all, we wouldn't want any of the other neighbors to see us and get the wrong idea." Steve took the coffee cup and went into the front room. He sat on the couch and placed the cup on the end table. Sandy followed him in and sat down at the card table a safe distance from the couch where Steve was sitting. "Okay, Steve, we can talk in here then," Sandy said, choosing her words carefully. "You like the way I look, and this morning you were hoping that I would give you a show. I will admit, I was just having a little fun teasing you. I knew it wouldn't take much to get you to be the one putting on a show." Steve replied, "After all, I'm just a mortal man, and there's a person like you across the street, so let me tell you I care about you." Sandy replied, "I thought you and Alex were friends, Steve. How can you come over here and make a move on your friend's wife?" Steve didn't respond, so Sandy continued, "You have a very pretty wife at home. You don't need to ruin your friendships and your marriage." Steve didn't reply but smiled at Sandy. She watched his eyes move slowly down her body to her legs and back up. Sandy stood up, held her arms out, and slowly turned so Steve could get a good look from all angles. "Is this what you want, Steve? You like watching me? What else do you want from me?" Steve stood up and said, "I want you to take off that halter top, and then I want you to remove those shorts. I think I deserve a good look at you." Tears began to well up in Sandy's eyes. She felt trapped. The only other time she'd been in a situation where she'd felt this scared was at a hotel pool when she was in Denver. When Jack forced her into the pool, she played along and was able to escape. Now she wondered if the same approach would help her this time. Steve interrupted her thoughts. "Stop crying, Sandy. I just want you to put on a little show for me like I did for you this morning." Sandy replied, I'm scared, Steve. Why don't you just leave and go home? I'll give you a show in front of the window. Just let me have a little time to think about it. What are you scared for, Sandy? This will just be between me and you. I won't say a word to Alex or anyone else. I'm ready for the show to start right now. Let me see that top come off. Sandy stuttered, I'm afraid if I take my clothes off you'll force me. Steve came up and stood in front of Sandy. The top of her head was barely chest level to Steve's tall frame. He looked down and said, Do I need to help you? Sandy begged in a crying voice, No, Steve, please just go. I promise that I'll undress in front of the window for you. Take that top off now. Take it off before I take it off for you, Steve shouted. Tears streamed down Sandy's face as she reached behind her back and untied the upper strings of the halter top. Slowly, very slowly, I want to enjoy every minute of it watching you do it, Steve said in a calmer voice. Sandy turned her back to Steve and untied the bottom threads. Then she slowly turned to face Steve again and carefully lowered her top. Steve raised his arm and motioned with his hand for her to spin around slowly so he could see all of her from front to back. Oh yes, Sandy, that's it. Look at you. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were 12 or 13 years old, he reasoned. Sandy stood with her head held high. She could see the desire in Steve's eyes as they roamed every part of her. She instinctively raised her hands to cover herself. I just like short, sleeved tops, he said. Now take your shorts down nice and slow, Sandy, you're doing great. Will you leave then, please? Sandy begged. Just do it and stop that crying. I want you to look pretty like you always do. Smile at me while you're getting out of those pants. Sandy did as she was told, but tried unsuccessfully to smile at her frightening neighbor. Sandy slowly turned to him. Turning to face Steve again, she slowly removed her clothes as Steve instructed, not wanting to go down to the last item of clothing she had left. Sandy looked up into Steve's eyes, hoping he would tell her that was enough. Suddenly he picked her up off from her feet the way a man carries his bride over the threshold. Please put me down, Steve, I'll show you the rest, she pleaded. Steve carried her up the stairs to the bedroom. Sandy, I think I want to spend time with you right in your bedroom. I saw you changing through your bedroom window, and for years I fantasized about me being there with you. As Steve carried Sandy into her bedroom, she was begging, Please don't do this, Steve, you said we were friends. Sandy was trying to get her hands or legs free, but Steve easily constrained her small, preteen-sized frame. Steve sat Sandy down while they were in the bedroom. He closed the door and stood in front of it. Sandy had nowhere to run. He stood for a moment admiring her figure. Steve said, I knew you would have the firm little body of a 14-year-old. Boy, it's been a long time since I've had a girl like you alone in the bedroom. Steve threw his clothes on the floor. Sandy then saw his excitement. At this point, Sandy decided that as a last resort, she would try to play it up to Steve and maybe have a chance to get away from him. If she could get to the bathroom in the hallway, she would be able to lock the door. Sandy moved closer to Steve and touched him. That's a good girl, Sandy. I knew you wanted it too. I knew it this morning, how you wanted to watch me. You didn't have to open that curtain and stand there looking the way you did. Sandy looked at her neighbor's excitement as Steve grabbed Sandy by the shoulders and pushed her towards the bed. He grabbed a handful of Sandy's hair from the back of her head and pulled her face closer to his, forcing her to pleasure himself. Come on, Sandy, you know how to do it. Good job. Sandy hugged Steve and started doing what he wanted. Come on, girl, you can do better than that, Steve croaked. He was quite rough, forcefully controlling her movements with her hair. He reached out and grabbed Sandy's ankles as he laid down on Sandy's bed, pulling her up. Steve continued to thrust, so Sandy had to relax so she wouldn't suffocate. As she got more comfortable, she felt that Steve was close to satisfaction. She made soft, muffled sounds when Steve was satisfied. Sandy hoped that this was all for him and he would leave her alone. She didn't know yet that Steve wasn't done with her. Rolling Sandy off of him and getting off the bed, he said, That was pretty good, Sandy. I bet you're just as good at other things. Now let's see you get rid of the last of your clothes nice and slow, dear. Sandy carefully did as told, after which she began tearing up again. But unsuccessfully. Turn over slowly, Sandy. I want to look at you, Steve said as he helped put away his clothes. Sandy slowly rolled over as she felt Steve's large hands rubbing and teasing her. Oh yes, it's a nice little beauty. I'm going to love it, he said. Sandy felt the mattress move as Steve crawled into a double bed next to her. Steve pushed her, indicating that he wanted her to roll onto her back. Sandy did as he wanted but quietly said, Please don't. Please, Steve, please, don't do this to me. Please stop, Steve. Just let me think about it. Maybe we can meet at a motel room later in the week and do it then. "Oh, I'm going to spend time with you, Sandy, right now," Steve said. He lowered himself to Sandy and looked at her. She could see his excitement building. He raised his face to hers and began to kiss her. Sandy didn't respond to his kisses, her lips pressed tightly together. Steve forced her mouth open as he continued the kiss. He ran his hand over it. To her surprise, she was also excited. Teasing her, he said, "Oh, yes, Sandy, you want this as much as I do, don't you?" He continued, "God, you feel lonely, oh my God, how did you last so long?" Sandy obeyed, knowing there was no way out of what was about to happen. Steve looked at Sandy in disbelief. "I haven't met such a lonely woman in a long time." Sandy responded by teasing Steve. Steve laughed and said, "That's right, Sandy, all that pleading is nice to hear, but when it comes down to it, you can't wait for me to please you." Steve started kissing Sandy again on the lips. This time she readily answered Steve. He liked how her demeanor had changed. They started spending time together. Steve had a feeling he couldn't compare to anything else. Then he said, "Sandy, I guess I'm going to have to get used to you. I was with different women with whom it was different." Now she was hugging Steve tightly and pulling him to her. "Come on, Steve, be with me, baby, I want it," she begged. With that, Steve pleased Sandy. She also experienced new sensations. Sandy, panting, cried, oh yes, baby, be with me." Sandy got the first pleasure. Within a few moves, Steve was satisfied as well. Steve could feel Sandy shaking. She had just enjoyed herself for the third time. Steve satisfied Sandy in ways she never knew existed. He rolled onto his back, pulling Sandy on top of him. Sandy leaned into him and they started kissing. After about 5 minutes of talking and caressing, Sandy said, "You know, you didn't need to be so pushy with me today. I was going to let you stay with me eventually. I just wanted to tease you a little first." Steve got out of bed and started to get dressed. He replied, "I guess I was a little impatient, but it was worth it. I've wanted to spend time with you since the day I saw you and your husband move. You know that this is not the last time either." Sandy put on her robe and replied, "Just do me a favor, Steve. Next time wait for an invitation." Steve wasn't going to let her have the last word, so before leaving he said, "Just don't wait too long to invite me." Sandy pulled the bedding off from her bed and moved it to the laundry room. She remade the bed with clean sheets and blankets before going into the bathroom and filling the bathtub with water. Standing in front of the mirror, she noticed a bruise the size of a quarter on her neck. She knew there would be no way to hide it from Alex. After Sandy had finished her bath, she returned to her room and sat at the vanity in front of her mirror. She brushed her hair, applied some makeup and eyeliner. She fastened a thin necklace around her neck and put in a small set of matching earrings. Sandy then attached the hot wife anklet to her ankle before going to her closet to find something to wear. She decided that she would wear her most attractive white outfit. She was wearing the sheer white blouse she had worn that morning with a short black skirt. Every time Alex asked her to wear this skirt, she called it the Stay With Me skirt. Sandy looked at herself in mirror. Her hair didn't hide the plaque well enough that it wasn't noticeable. Sandy pushed her hair back and tied it in a ponytail, the bruises now clearly visible on her neck. Then she tied a purple bow on it and put on black heels. Sandy fixed herself a drink and went out to the patio. Alex would be home soon. Subscribe to our channel so that your second C gaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.